Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this program is World Watchers. This is program number 765, August the 4th, 1984. I want to begin the broadcast by apologizing. I'm way behind in my mail. I usually fill the envelopes with the bibliography sheets that you send for. I'm about 2 months behind. I'll catch up maybe within the next 3 weeks. I've been going back and forth to Los Angeles, where I've had a very sick mother for the past 5 months. She's been just literally dying, and that has taken a lot of time, driving 300 miles each way between Carmel and L.A. She passed away this week, and as things quiet down now and the uncertainty as the trips and so forth takes over, I will get back to getting that mail out as fast as I can. Several months ago, when she was just about going into a coma and she was very, very weak, she looked at me and said, "Are you going to wear stockings to my funeral?" And I answered her, "If you die in the winter, yes, and if it's in the summer, no." Hard daughter to have, you must agree. Poor thing had to put up with me. She was 92 years old, and I'm 64, so she had that many years of May around. And right to the very end, she was trying to put her stamp, her Victorian stamp or mode, on what I should be doing. I want to mention the meeting that took place at the Bohemian Grove this past 2 weeks. I didn't get a chance to talk about it while it was taking place, but that really isn't too important. It will continue every year. Guests at the camp every year, the main stars are Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, William Buckley, and I mentioned several years ago when Henry Kissinger came in, they play Hail to the Chief. Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig are the proteges of that mysterious and never seen Fritz Kramer. I understand Daniel Ludwig, the mysterious Mr. Ludwig, who isn't seen too often, was at Bohemian Grove this past session. Now, if you want information on what Bohemian Grove is, you can send for tape cassettes or books on the material. It's very important to keep up with what this organization is and how important it is in our lives. This year they handed out a notice along with information on Bohemian Grove. What is big mountain relocation issue? The United States government is forcefully removing thousands of Navajo people from their homeland. And this reference sheet about the Bohemian Grove goes into the coal and uranium industries and the relocation law, and the Peabody Coal Company that's just one company that gains from moving the Indians from that particular territory. Then the information goes on, what are the Bohemian Grove connections? There are many Bohemians who pay their club dues out of revenues realized from the sacred ground at Big Mountain. In the view of the elders, the real reason for the relocation is to promote the coal and uranium. Peabody Coal is one of the largest offenders. Bechtel Corporation owns 15% of Peabody Coal. S.D. Bechtel Jr. and Sr. are longtime Grove members and members of most prestigious camp, the Mandalay. They have built a family dynasty from their connections with business partners and advisors, including John McCone, former director of the CIA, also a Knight of Malta, the late Herbert Hoover and Edgar Kaiser, and others. Former Bechtel employees Caspar Weinberger and George Schultz are doing their power to promote the ambitions of the club members. Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Henry Kissinger are members. Also, Bechtel's connections to the nuclear power industry. They built Diablo Canyon, Sant Onofre, and others. This is legendary. Boeing Corporation holds 15% share of Peabody Coal, and of course Alexander Haig is now on the board of Boeing. Among their 5 Bohemian board members, directors, are Stanley Hiller of Crocker Bank, who supports apartheid in South Africa, David Packard of Hewlett-Packard. He was on the 40 committee in the National Security, and he was director of the Defense Department under Richard Nixon. And the 40 committee, along with Henry Kissinger, are 5 people who decide who is assassinated by the CIA and what coups will take place. D.E. Skinner sits on the board of PG&E. He helped build Diablo Canyon and Humboldt nukes, and he's part of the Peabody Coal. The Fluor Corporation owns 10% of Peabody Coal. It was founded by CIA Director John McCone, who has brought present CIA Director William Casey as a guest to Bohemian Grove. It his one-time business partner was Mr. Bechtel. Mr. Casey was also a business partner of these people. Along with the Mandalay camp mate Edgar Kaiser, who built Liberty ships for World War II, and the Hoover Dam with the blessing of the Bohemian Grove buddy Herbert Hoover, who was a campmate of Richard Nixon. And then it goes on to say space does not allow examination of the uranium nuclear corporations plundering the American Indians' lands, Kerr-McGee, Mobil, Conoco, United, Nuclear, Exxon, and others have Bohemian Grove connections, and they have direct interest into the uranium and the coal that is under the land where the Navajos are being replaced. Now you can write to this organization, Bohemian Grove Action Network, P.O. Box 216, Occidental, California, 95465. If that goes too fast, just write to me, self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll send you the sheet with his address. You can get an audio cassette on the power of Bohemian Grove, video cassettes. For $1 each, you can get leaflets such as Henry Kissinger and the Mandalay Camp, the Livermore Lab connections to the Bohemian Grove, the Manhattan Project's connections to the Grove, women in the Grove. Women are excluded there, of course. And there's a $2 article about Henry Kissinger and his relationship to the people at Bohemian Grove and other selected news articles. There is a network informing you about the Grove. Now, there's another organization that isn't as well known as Bohemian Grove, and this is a very interesting phenomenon that takes place in Wyoming. And this is a group of people from the aviation industry, entirely aviation industry, and they call themselves the Conquistadores. I thought of the tall ships that were in the harbor celebrating the Statue of Liberty, and know that the Conquistadores ships were for plundering South America, Central America, even America, and all over the world for Spain, and they were conquering ships that helped decimate native population. Now, there's an encampment in Wyoming that was described in Wall Street Journal. This was last year, September 17th last year. Folks tell of strange doings every Labor Day. It's near Charlie's Gate at A Dude Ranch. The night riders have the armor of Spanish explorers. They descend from the hills in an eerie torchlight procession, aimed at summoning spirits of the conquistadores from centuries past. In the daytime, grown men wear dresses, and they chase each other in horseback. Other times, they do knife throwing and fast drawing. These fellows are chiefs of nearly every big airline and aerospace company in the United States: Boeing, General Dynamics, Lockheed, McDonnell Douglas, Rockwell International. The talk is about Conquistadores del Cielo, Spanish for conquerors of the sky. This is an exclusive and extremely secretive group. About 11 executives run it. The ranch is owned by Mr. Gates, chairman of Gates Learjet. The Conquistadores president in 1985 was Delta Airlines chairman David Garrett. The group was started by TWA executives in 1937. That's just at the height, I think, the parallels of this country and what Hitler was doing in Germany, with some of his high people dressed in dresses in the same type of manner over there at the same time. It was started in 1937 as a social club with former aviators that were into the aviation business. The one thing they have is a passion for secrecy. Bohemian Grove in California is best known of the business-oriented clubs. The Conquistadores' passion for secrecy, plus the remote site in Wyoming, escaped scrutiny so far. The group concentrates the top 2 or 3 executives of companies and industries that have provoked concerns about industry collusion in the past. Ralph Nader said that the Conquistador meetings hardly encourage free enterprise regarding airfares, defense contracts, getting information about air service because it's such a tight-knit family. Paul Thayer, a member of the Conquistadores, a member after 25 years, proved an embarrassment as Deputy Defense Secretary in the Reagan administration when he divulged insider information about corporate dealings. He's now serving 4 years in prison. And that is one of the dangers of these people getting together. For the one that gets caught, there are probably thousands that never do. Thayer used a Conquistador meeting to discuss the takeover battle between Bendix Corporation and LTV. Thayer was chairman of LTV, and he was director of Allied Corporation in 1982. Allied won the takeover. His company won the takeover. United Technologies chairman Harry Gray and Martin Marietta Corporation chairman Thomas Pownall, Bendix suitors, attended the conquistador meetings, and they were scheduled to testify if Thayer actually went to trial. Charles Rochester, assistant U.S. attorney, prosecuted Thayer. He said he couldn't find evidence that the group was part of the scheme of leaking information, but the conquistadors was a place where they met, and later Thayer was linked to contacts in the conquistador meetings. The conquistadors have a way that is helpful for them and harmless to competition. Wayne Hoffman, chairman of Tiger International, was president in 1979. It was a conquistador meeting several years ago that Frank Lorenz, president of Texas Air Corporation, linked Continental's then chairman Robert Seeks by suggesting a Texas Air Continental merger. Texas Air won control of Continental in 1981. Frank Borman of Eastern Airlines quit several years ago. He wasn't happy with the frivolous nature of most conquistador activities. No women are invited, like Bohemian Grove. To be invited there, you have to get an invitation, and I believe it's open to the wives for just one evening. They are prohibited from attending the meetings are people in the government per se. These are the airline bosses and not the government. That makes it different than Bohemian Grove. But the contestants race horses around a corral. They wear dresses and racing back and forth in their dresses. Mr. Puckett and Sanford McDonald, chairman of McDonald Corporation, are pictured with pink frocks flapping behind them in the wind. Members wear 16th century costumes. They purchased them 34 years ago from the Royal Spanish Opera. Some wear ruffs. Others had military metal breastplates made and helms. The men wear the breastplates, and the women dress as the grand dames of the Spanish era. Some paint on beards, and they glue on whiskers, and they have a great time, a huge viva, which is an illumination with a torch bearing it with the riders. Now, this doesn't compare, as I say, with the Bohemian Grove, but it is an example of the men dressing up like ladies, which they do at the Bohemian Grove, and they dress in their ballet tutus and other women's clothing at both places, and these men seem to have a desire to dress like women for their very private vacations. This type of vacationing may not seem important considering all the news that is pouring out these days, just gushing out, but think of the mindset of the people who run our CIA, the Knights of Malta like Vernon Walters and William Casey and William Buckley, and I could go on, and people from the Defense Department who are knighted into the Roman Catholic Church. The Knights of Malta began in the year 1000, and so in 1986, these men are wearing breastplates and spears and dresses of the 16th century, which isn't really far off from when the Knights were formed, and there's a lot of decision-making in the White House, particularly with Ronald Reagan, with the staunch Knights of Malta, William Wilson, and I could go, through the list of hundreds of names having high government positions, and it's interesting that some of them get together and have the need to go back to the 16th century with, as I say, the breastplates and even to dress as ladies. There's an article this past week about some Americans that were arrested in the Soviet Union as CIA agents, and the Soviet Union said Monday that the agents rehearsed their lines and put on makeup and wigs and women's clothing like Dustin Hoffman did in Tootsie. The government newspaper Izvestia ridiculed the agents, calling them diplomats who work for the CIA who are frustrated actors, and they referred to the way they get dressed up, and it's well known to the Soviet audiences, the movies such as Tootsie, but something very similar was taking place in the United States Embassy. A thick-set man with prominent belly and red mustache was being transformed into a woman, nice in every respect, with the help of a nylon bust, rouged mask, flower print blouse. The newspaper said the disguise was used on a spy mission, and one of those spies that was arrested last week was dressed as a lady. They referred to Tootsie, in which Dustin Hoffman played an unemployed actor who dresses as a woman to get a role in the soap opera, and it was a big hit in the Soviet Union in 1983. Izvestia said the government newspaper said the U.S. official who dressed in women's clothing was Lewis Thomas, a U.S. Embassy security officer who was expelled in June of '83 on espionage charges. It was Michael Sellers, a U.S. political attaché, ordered to leave the country this year, who rehearsed dialogue and prepared his wardrobe before meeting a Soviet citizen in a clandestine encounter. Sellers usually wore a false mustache, glasses, and wig that were transformed into a Russian-style rabbit fur cap. Sellers, not without reason, had the reputation of a talented actor in the Central Intelligence Agency. Another diplomat transformed himself from an elegant young man to a weak-sided old man in spectacles for intelligence missions. Virtually everyone in the CIA reports to such tricks, from a small spy stuck among the participants of the anti-war movement to the director of the CIA himself. And remember the disguises. E. Howard Hunt shared with us a little bit about them at the time of Watergate, and he was one of the highest officials of the Central Intelligence Agency. So a spy, or several of them, have been recognized in disguise, and they're now being discussed as having dressed as women. I imagine a lot of the encouragement is similar to, it's not just disguise, but they probably like it, similar to the Bohemian Grove and to the Conquistadores. Mary Bancroft wrote a book about her experiences in the CIA, Autobiography of a Spy, published by William Morrow in 1983 out of New York. She was an interesting woman from a New England family, very prominent, who went into the OSS and served with the CIA after that with Allen Dulles, was his mistress, and was over in Europe helping him spy and living with a Nazi so that she could pick up information about Adolf Hitler while she was the liaison between the Nazi regime, one of them, a Mr. Gisevius, and then she would report back to Allen Dulles, who became her lover. Interesting, in this book, in her autobiography, she's talking about Carl Jung, and she went to work with him in Switzerland, also got fascinated with Jung. She said, one day Jung asked me if I ever heard the rumors that Gisevius, this friend of hers, flew regularly to advise Adolf Hitler. Of course I had, and she said this was common knowledge to me, and it amused me greatly, and he chuckled. Then Jung thought the stories about his flying to Hitler had been started when Dr. Ferdinand Sauerbach, the famous Berlin surgeon who was supposed to be treating Hitler, began coming to Switzerland. And he asked me if Americans had heard that Hitler had begun to drink heavily. Then it goes on, I told Jung I never succeeded in persuading anyone. He asked her if about Mein Kampf and the reaction of people to that. And I told Carl Jung I'd never succeeded in persuading anyone to read Mein Kampf. I couldn't get them to buy it, even to read it, but they toss it aside, announce it as the man that was crazy, and refuse to continue. And she's telling this to the well-known psychoanalyst. They wouldn't even listen to his speeches for the same reason. It was no use pointing out to them that the insane asylums were full of people, none of whom had ever caused the havoc Hitler had. I found Mein Kampf fascinating, not only because it contained Hitler's plan of action that he seemed to be carrying out to the letter, but it also showed such a shrewd understanding of how to manipulate the psychology of the German people. Jung said the Germans were as clever about their own psychology as they were stupid about other people's. Certainly one of the best ways to learn about them was to study them at work on themselves. And he also said Goering could never exercise the magic that Hitler did, and they were talking about the various people that they knew and the hold that they had psychologically on the masses. Allen Dulles was interested in Jung's opinion of the effectiveness of Allied propaganda. Jung never ceased to point out the futility of negative propaganda, and he emphasized that the Germans spoke positively and gave them positive things on their own radio stations rather than the negative, and that he knew how to use the mind. Hitler used psychology. Instead of being a patient of psychology, he used it, and the real patients are the people who wouldn't read what he wrote. He was telling them something and was analyzed as crazy, and the truth was that Hitler turned out not to be so crazy. At least he was financed by the corporations and bankers all over the world who were sorry, actually, that he lost the war, and he had that charisma. But a lot of people missed the point about who Hitler was or what kind of thing he was, trying to say he was insane, where he really almost had control of the whole world. Very early in the war, there were some people, one man in particular, who risked his life to go to the Americans and to the OSS in Great Britain and tell them about the extermination camps. And again, the people didn't believe him. Justice Goldberg and future Chief Justice Frankfurter, they just couldn't believe what he was saying, and they didn't have any comprehension that things like this went on and the information was rejected. And there's a new book out called Breaking the Silence by Walter LaCour and Richard Breitman, published by Simon & Schuster. And this is about the individual, a Gentile, who, in August 1942, who went to London from Switzerland and tried to inform people about what was going on because he wasn't satisfied with Adolf Hitler. But his efforts didn't work because nobody wanted to believe him. And after the information came out that he was the messenger carrying these facts, why he disappeared. Nobody knew who he was, and this is the first research to dig him out and get the story about the gentleman with the courage to leave his offices in Switzerland, where he was doing quite well, and his name was Edward Schulte, S-C-H-U-L-T-E. The interesting thing is, in the book review in the New York Times, it says Schulte's efforts to alert the outside world to the Nazis' intention to murder the Jews of Europe proved in vain. Not until millions had perished did the Allies accept the truth of the information he was the first to deliver. Even then, after he delivered, there was no measure to halt the slaughter. Schulte never went on delivering data to Allied intelligence because, at the end of 1943, he was almost unmasked, and in return he would have been killed, when a Swiss typist in his employ found a carbon copy used to copy a report he had written for the American agent Allen Dulles, and turned it over to her lover, an SS man. So this poor gentleman, Edward Schulte, was reporting to Allen Dulles about the extermination camps, and Allen Dulles was living in Bern, Switzerland, working also with people like SS Karl Wolff, who was simultaneously running Treblinka and the gas extermination camps, and Allen Dulles was literally in bed with the Nazis from the time he moved to Bern, Switzerland. He became our future director of the Central Intelligence Agency, but the very fellow who had confidence that somebody would do something for him, it didn't happen that way, and Allen Dulles was the man who was receiving his information, and you wonder why more wasn't done, because Dulles could quiet it on all cables coming to the United States at that point and make sure that nobody responded to the information coming. Now, I mentioned last week a new executive order that Ronald Reagan passed, and I didn't have the exact number. I thought I had it, and actually it was right. And the order was, in 1981, President Reagan issued Executive Order 12333, which empowers the Central Intelligence Agency to operate domestically under certain circumstances. And, of course, he determines the circumstances. That is Order 12333. So he has the power. Now, as I mentioned last week, the military can go into 50 states for the first time. The military can legally take over for anything if they think it's terrorism, drugs, and so forth. And domestically, the CIA has been allowed to do this since 1981. I feel sorry that I can't update the stories because of lack of time, again, on Jonathan J. Pollard. And I want you, listeners, to save the articles and help me just give a little time and space, and I'll go on to that spying operation that is so important. And the Israeli operations have a lot to do with James Angleton working with Rafael Eitan. I mentioned that before. For 20 years, until 1974, the Mossad and the Israeli government were really bonded to American intelligence, to James Angleton, who was a part of the Permindex operation and the assassination team that killed John Kennedy. And James Angleton had set up really a murder incorporated that included Rafael Eitan of the Mossad, included drug dealing and murder. And I'll get more details and outline. I have approximately 70 or 80 good articles, and we can't do all of them, but I'll share a few with you and outline those for you on the special relationship of Israel to the intelligence community. Now, this whole story keeps bubbling over more and more because the right-wing newspapers, such as the New Solidarity, and Liberty Lobby keep pressuring the story of why isn't the Defense Department prosecuting the Israeli spies or going into it more? How deep does it go? And it involves uranium that's missing and a lot of other things. And the answer is that Israel is the buffer to send weapons to the Contras, to the Argentine military dictatorship it was in, to South Africa, and they're also involved in Pakistan and all over the world where there's drugs and assassinations, and the Defense Department gets nudged by the far right to go into these connections, and the CIA, headed also by George Shultz and William Casey, trying to stop the investigations because the use of Israel, of the Mossad, with our own 40 committee to do the dirty work that we needed done in exchange for the drug traffic that became so lucrative. There was a report, I guess all of you heard it on the evening news this past week, U.S. may end shuttles commercial launches. Now, the first announcement on the news was that the shuttle space program, NASA, will be diverted to the military. NASA will become military and literally part of the Defense Department. That's exactly what I said was the motive of letting the Challenger blow up, as an excuse because we're limited to turn over the whole Defense Department, the NASA that was supposed to be civilian, to the Defense Department. They also are trying to ease out the Houston Space Center, the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and move it to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, where the Werner von Braun, Walter Dornberger clique, the Project Paperclip, the Nazi scientists that wanted to use space to control the world, controlled the decision that the shuttle would launch no matter what kind of weather, and they're getting more power right now as of this directive. They announced that the Department of Defense has 28 loads to go, and they literally will try to merge space with defense. Now, even a few very conservative congressmen and senators, Orrin Hatch for one, was outraged to hear this, and the trickery of combining these two I detailed in my many broadcasts on the Challenger, and showed how in 1983, when Edward Teller gave the speech with Ronald Reagan, or wrote it for him on Star Wars, of March 83, and then the use of the Korean airline line, the spying ship that was blown up for the military budget for the Star Wars, and then the Challenger going down with these tragedies and accidents, which are experimental also in nature. They get so much more out of it, and by the Challenger going down, it separated what is civilian space from war, and the space area will be turned over to the military, and they'll use rockets that are not manned by people, automatic rockets, or put payloads over in Europe or elsewhere, and now say because of the Challenger accident, the space has become military. That was the intention 40 years ago, but they created these crises that made it come about. They also published the conversation in the cockpit. I'm sure many of you saw it, but there was something very interesting in it. At 1:47 before it launched, Mr. Smith, the co-pilot, whose wife has sued NASA for $23 million for a knowledgeable death, a death that was caused through information that could have been avoided, Smith says, okay, there goes the LOX arm, and they referred to the vent arm that covers the tip of the shuttle's external tank during fuel loading that carries oxygen vapor and prevents ice buildups. The part that prevents ice buildups, which was important, and I don't know too much about spaceships, but the device is known as a beanie cap. And 1 minute later, Scobie said, goes the beanie cap, that's the cap, the external cap, the tip that covers this area. And Onizuka, the one of the NASA men on this space Challenger, said, doesn't it go the other way? And they laughed. And then Mr. Smith, Commander Smith, said, God, I hope not. And Onizuka said, I can't see it moving. It was behind the center screen. Now, I talked to somebody familiar with the space shuttle program and has seen launches. He told me they were only joking. But I don't think just a minute before launch that a pilot would say, God, I hope not. Because if he's being told something, he could stop it right there, I should think, and scratch the launch at that point 1 moment before going. But is he taking a risk? You're right. You know, if you're right, we're okay. We're in trouble. If you're wrong, it'll be disastrous. What did he mean by, I hope not? That doesn't sound like the usual language of people just about to launch, particularly on the cold weather, knowing the problems of the cold weather. The article in the New York Times, July 26, says, head of NASA attempts to calm Houston's fear on the roll in space, and Mr. Fletcher is apologizing for the fact that the power will be moved to Alabama, and the defense civilian part of it will be eased out pretty much. They'll ease it out and give the attention to the military as the Johnson Space Center becomes maybe a relic, a dinosaur of the space past. Who knows? I'll take a 1-minute break now because the tape is about up, and then I want to update a few items of the news very quickly with you. This is Mae Brussell, and it's side 2 of broadcast number 765. The program is World Watchers. There was a brief article in Parade magazine, a comment about Faye Dunaway, who's in London now, and she is acting in Don Freed's play Circe and Bravo, and Harold Pinter, the well-known playwright, has directed the movie, and it's doing very well in London. They described this play that she's doing in Parade as saying she's playing the wife of a U.S. president under the close care of a Secret Service agent. The drama resembles the true life story of the late Martha Mitchell, colorful wife of John Mitchell, Attorney General in the Nixon cabinet. Mrs. Mitchell said she was held political prisoner at Newport Beach, California, during the Watergate cover-up because she knew too much. I think the people that have listened to World Watchers for a long time remember that I saw that play in Los Angeles, that Don Freed told me that he had written that play with me in mind because I wrote the article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, in 1972, and Don was the person who set up the conference at the LA Press Club and was very helpful presenting that to the various news media around the world, who received it with as much clamor as they did Hitler's Mein Kampf. They didn't take that seriously either. I'm very happy that it's doing well, and if Faye Dunaway stays in it, it will go to New York and then hopefully come around to the West Coast also. The important thing about that I think at this time is that Mr. Rehnquist is having the hearings for becoming Justice of the Supreme Court, and in the course of his hearings this past week, the subject came up about his work as Deputy Attorney General under John Mitchell and Robert Mardian, and the plans for a coup in the United States and overthrow of the United States government, a martial law plan. Now, Mr. Rehnquist is very much against the Constitution. He's voted about 40 or 50 times against, even against all his other partners on the Supreme Court, and he believes the states should have more power than the federal Constitution. He's an anti-constitutionalist. He's a member of the John Birch Society, and he also was part of a team that was planning martial law. That was the gist of my article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And this plot included G. Gordon Liddy and Egil Crow, the plumbers team that worked with Rehnquist under Henry Kissinger in the White House. Now, Ronald Reagan has refused to release the papers of the martial law plan. Ronald Reagan in California was part of the martial law with his garden plot, with Edwin Meese, the military, tying into Washington and the takeover and overthrow of the United States government as an elected government. It'll be interesting to see if any more comes of this. Ronald Reagan absolutely will not release the martial law plan, but Louis Tackwood was the first person to speak about it in the Los Angeles Police Department in 1971, that a plan was made to overthrow this country, even to kill Richard Nixon, to put Spiro Agnew in power. I did a broadcast on Tom Pappas and the Greek military junta links to the CIA and the martial law plan that was woven together under the power of Pappas working with the Greek military junta and Nazis in Europe and a conduit of our Central Intelligence Agency. Mr. Rehnquist becomes probably the Justice of the Supreme Court, a man who was in charge and wanted the martial law to go through, and Ronald Reagan, who would adore a situation that would create the excuse for his remaining in office. The situation there is ripe, and as I said before, when the Challenger went down, the next Challenger would have had the plutonium, and that would have been an excuse for Reagan to cancel the elections and have the martial law. So it's interesting that Rehnquist is now being challenged about his work with G. Gordon Liddy and Nigel Crow and the White House plumbers and the Defense Department in trying to push the martial law plan. It's very dangerous to think how close they are to that event, because the proper people that worked for it 12 years ago are in a position to do it under any given set of circumstances right now. Well, the late Roy Cohn passed away, and I won't do too much about him, just bits and pieces and more next week or the week after, because there's so much coming out about Roy Cohn. One interesting part of Roy Cohn's life was his association with Aristotle Onassis. He worked for Onassis, and Onassis was planning to divorce Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis, and the arrangement was to start the wheels going. She was spending too much money. They weren't sleeping together anyway, etc., etc. And the attorney to represent Onassis in the divorce plan was Roy Cohn. Now, Roy Cohn was on the board of PERMINDEX. His name runs through in and out of the Torbett document, the description of the people behind the murder of John Kennedy. So it's interesting that the widow of John Kennedy marries Onassis, and then a man who's in an organization that whereby he's accused of being part of the teamwork that had John Kennedy murdered is the attorney for Aristotle Onassis. A nice little web of relationships that continued from one administration to the other and affected a lot of people in different ways. Roy Cohn was very close to George Steinbrenner. He was attorney. Steinbrenner owns the New York Yankees. Real estate mogul Donald Trump, he's very close to him. He owns the New Jersey General football team. He just helped Trump win a $74 million tax-exempt foundation on his towers just a year or two ago in New York City. Trump really needed a tax exemption of $74 million. It was William Casey who helped Fernand Marcos and Imelda Marcos get off of paying tax on their multi-million-dollar property in New York by setting up dummy fronts in Panama. People high up in the administration helped us be reduced of taxes that we need in our cities by making sure these people get the maximum from their profits. Roy Cohn had a law partner, Mr. Bolin, who was a Knight of Malta. He is still the partner, still a Knight of Malta. And interestingly enough, this very terribly ugly Jewish courier was a liaison between Cardinal Spellman and J. Edgar Hoover, doing a lot of passing of messages and spying. He also represented, in his lifetime, he's gone now, one of the top family members of the Genovese family, and he was representing the Mafia throughout his entire career as an attorney. There was a large arrest in February of 1985. We don't hear much about it. That was Paul Castellano, who was gunned down, and Tony Corallo, Anthony Salerno, and Ginori Langella, and Philip Rastelli. They were all arrested in 1985. 5 families and their bosses. There was an article about the Gambino, Lucchese, Genovese, Colombo, and Bonanno family. Well, Roy Cohn was the attorney for Anthony Fat Salerno, allegedly once headed the Charles Lucky Luciano connection, which was Tom Dewey and Earl Warren and the OSS, Central Intelligence Agency connections, and the Vito Genovese connections. Now, Vito Genovese worked and brought money to a place where a general was, where Jack Ruby was, and the payoffs for what happened in Dallas were taking place just prior to the murder of John Kennedy, not too long before. And interestingly enough, the head of the family, this Genovese family, the attorney for that person when he was arrested in New York recently, was Roy Cohn. He has a long history of working with organized crime. There's an article in the San Francisco Examiner that you don't see often in a Hearst paper just last month by Warren Hinkle called Assassination Incorporated. And I want to share that with you because last week I talked about Ronald Reagan's war against drugs and using the military to invade Bolivia, given that it's a democracy now, and making it safe later for cocaine and fascism. The article says that the Arctic trails have their secret tales that could make your blood run cold, said Robert Service, but alas, the Nixon administration also is capable of having these same trails that lead to places equally as cold. What John Ehrlichman talked when he steered about the Nixon rehabilitation process wouldn't take place because there would always be new disclosures about Richard Nixon. Johnny with the hatchet was Seymour Hersh, the My Lai investigative reporter who originally was talking about the Nixon administration, and in 1972 they considered assassinating General Manuel Antonio Noriega, a little Caesar in Panama, and now Hersh is bringing this up again and making front page story about the plans of the CIA to kill the president of Panama a few years ago when Nixon was in office. What they actually proposed was the total and complete immobilization of the drug trade-linked general, which was apparently the euphemism for assassination during the Watergate presidency. That is at least an improvement over the coarser terminate with extreme prejudice in vogue during the bloody Camelot years. Hersh cites a Senate Intelligence Committee report that says officials of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, a forerunner of the DIA, considered assassinations as an option. The Purity of the post-Watergate period launched an investigation of 4 known instances of formal and informal assassination plots by federal agencies during the Nixon administration. Hersh says it could not be learned what the 3 other assassination plots were. We know about the one planned to kill Fidel Castro. They used exotic weapons and continued this up through the Nixon administration, then on up. It's still going on. It hasn't ended. And he cites the murder of Salvador Allende as being one of those people murdered by the CIA. The U.S. media gave the Cuban allegation, the plans to kill Castro, short shrift and paid not too much attention to it, but various people who captured assassins were hired and displayed by the people in Cuba, and our media looked the other way. It wasn't until the CIA's interface with the Mafia to murder Castro was revealed that people became concerned. It was okay to murder Castro and he would show these assassins, but on the other hand, when we hired the Mafia to be part of the assassination team, the drug runners, that's pretty bad. And he cites Patrick Hemmings, who was involved in 1971 plot against Fidel Castro, Tony Veciana, a founder of the Cuban exile group of Alpha 66 of the CIA, and he cites the Select Committee on Assassinations. They couldn't prove Veciana's CIA case officer had suspicious ties to Lee Harvey Oswald, Veciana working with the anti-Castro Cubans and not with Fidel Castro. The Senate did reporting on these assassination teams. Hinkle said, the report about Nixon aides considered assassinating the Panama general. Jim Hogan wrote in his book, Spooks, about these assassination plots and about the Drug Enforcement Agency, considered deploying an assassination squad of Cuban exiles to kill 150 drug dealers in Latin America. Then the White House would have Chuck Colson and E. Howard Hunt sitting around discussing whether they should drug Jack Anderson. They were capable of anything, he said, except rehabilitation. Assassination has always been and is very much part of the intelligence community and the drug operations, and a lot of people want to ignore that, but it continues, and in the operations that are going on in Bolivia or wherever we send our army, we will be wiping out only a section of those countries to make drug dealing safe for the others. Many of you may or may not know that the agreement of sending the American troops into Bolivia this past week, the past 2 weeks, was that they wipe out 10,000 acres of the cocaine pod or bean or whatever it is, and of the 90,000 acres, 80,000 would remain intact. The agreement was to wipe out 10,000 and leave 80,000 intact. So with all that publicity, we don't intend to stop cocaine coming to the United States. Speaking of drug dealing, assassinations, and the CIA, there's an interesting article about a notorious family in the paper this past week. This had to do with the murder of the parents of Madame New. And the son, her brother, Madame New's brother, an attorney, has been held responsible for killing his parents in Washington. The Los Angeles Times had a story. The son of the exiled former South Vietnamese ambassador to the United States was arrested and charged with murdering his parents. The parents were found in their home. The excuse for death was not immediately known, but the person who did it is pretty well confirmed it was the son. This couple that was murdered, Tran Vong Chung and his wife, Nam Tran Chung, she was also a representative of the United Nations for Vietnam. They were the parents of Madame Ngo, known as the Dragon Lady. Madame Ngo died of the parents died of asphyxiation. The daughter lives in Rome. And the article goes on to describe the family, and how Madame Ngo was active as First Lady for her brother-in-law, Mr. Diem of Southeast Asia, who was murdered by the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, the Diem administration and Madame Ngo and her parents are devout Catholics. And Madame Ngo is a Catholic, a devout Catholic, and her family were opposed to the Buddhists being killed and setting fire to themselves, and they were more sympathetic to the Buddhist regime. They were sympathetic to the Buddhist clergymen, and Mr. Diem was murdered partly because of a conflict of the Catholics versus the Buddhists, and people refer to the Vietnam War as Cardinal Spellman's War. There was a large role in religion that played down there, and it's playing itself out, I guess, still. And these parents, one was a Confucian and the other a Buddhist. Their daughter was converted to Catholicism, and the Diem administration fell, and Diem and his brother were killed, and she fled abruptly, settling in Italy. Now, when she left this country, she actually moved to Bel Air, and she was just about 1 block away from where we lived in Los Angeles before I moved to Carmel. And at that time, she was traveling around the country within 30 days after John Kennedy was murdered, saying that the communists killed Kennedy, the same communists that killed my husband and the officials, my brother-in-law down there, the relatives, they were communists that killed them. And she was very vocal about that. And she was a spokeswoman for the Republican Party in Paris. And after she was there a short time, I forget the time sequence, but I have the articles, she said that the Central Intelligence Agency did the killings down there. It wasn't the communists. And then she was disinvited from the Republican nomination parties where she was supposed to speak and return to this country. And she went off in silence, a devout Catholic, and she lived in Paris. And then her daughter, going to the Sorbonne, was she was killed in a car accident. Let's say it was a coincidental accident outside the Sorbonne somewhere in France. And that's when she went into seclusion in Rome and hasn't spoken up since that time. Now, she had an interview this past week, very rare for her. Madame Ngo angrily ends her silence. Madame Ngo gained notoriety during the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, made a rare public statement yesterday about the arrest of her brother in the slaying of her diplomat parents. Madame Ngo, who was President Diem's sister-in-law, said the United States has no right to judge any member of her family, meaning her brother, the Catholic like her who killed the parents. You don't have any right to judge my brother, she said. After what has been done against Vietnam, my country, my people, and my family by the United States, without it ever having contemplated reparation, I don't recognize their right to question and judge any of mine, she said. In the early 60s, as her father was ambassador to Washington and mother at the United Nations, Madame Ngo and her father openly clashed over the Diem regime policies. Her husband headed Vietnam's secret police. She served as its first lady, and as I say, was known as the Dragon Lady. She went into exile in Italy after the death of her 2 brothers, November the 1st, 1963. As I say, to correct it, and whoever wrote the article doesn't have it right, she went into exile after the death of her daughter, but she was seen and heard from for a while, at least a year or 2, until she realized that the CIA was involved in these murders. She said she was bitter over the description of herself in the press. She hadn't made any statement in years, but she felt that we had no right to say anything about her brother. He killed her parents, and that's his business, not ours. There's another important article or anniversary this week that might slip the attention of some people because of so much news, but really made very historic changes in the way we perceive people after this event. The event was the murder on the Texas campus, the University of Texas, by Charles Whitman, of 16 people. He killed these people, went up to the tower and shot them, and apparently seemed to be a deranged person from the Vietnam War who got out his anger. He killed his members of his family, and then he went up on top of this 27-story tower and started shooting for an hour and a half or an hour and a quarter. And following him came Richard Speck, who killed 17 days later a group of 8 student nurses in Chicago, and no charges were filed in the Boston Strangler place. He also did a lot of murders right afterwards, but they couldn't find evidence of the Boston Strangler. And the important thing about this Vietnam veteran, who was under the care of psychiatrists before it happened, a few months before the shooting, he was telling a campus psychiatrist that he was going to the tower and start shooting. The politics involved John Connally and Dr. Irwin and Dr. Sweet, who were in Boston and later linked up with a member of the Central Intelligence Agency, Jolly West. And John Connally suggested that they take part of Whitman's brain and test it. And this was the beginning of testing the brains to see the causes of violence. Not whether the psychiatrist had talked him into it, but it was a way to extend the mind control programs that took place under Adolf Hitler with the psychiatrist and link violence to brain disease, and thereby the necessity to change and study the brains of people given a set of circumstances. And then these doctors wanted to get the brains of black people during the riots in Detroit after Martin Luther King was killed in 1968, and they have just recently come out with reports, a whole series of new reports on violence and the brain. Actually, they couldn't find anything in Whitman's brain, and later it was missing, but they used this event as excuse for what would begin a large suspicion or rounding up of minorities under the guise that there's something in their brain that's different than other people. Now, the New York Times had a story this past week, July 23rd. Black doctors urged to look for violent signs in patients. Not members of Madame News family, and certainly not all these Klan and Nazi terrorists that are all white in the Aryan nations, and the murders that they want to do by stringing people across the country and cutting their throat. They're telling the blacks to look into their own people for homicidal feelings. And I haven't updated with you a lot of articles on mind control, psychosurgery, electric machines again to put on the brains. They're bringing a lot of this back, and they're telling them to look at the blacks, while people like Mr. Whitman, he was a person in the service who had no problems and no mental problems, and he was an Eagle Scout and a devout Christian, and just like Charles Watson, came from Texas, and he was an Eagle Scout and a devout Christian, and comes to Beverly Hills and then begins to join a group known as the Manson family, where he does these killings. Charles Manson was never in the home. But the Whitman story, going back in the past years, was the sounding off or the study of minorities when Whitman was a white man and transferred the event to study, and interestingly enough, the Boston Strangler was white and Speck was white and so forth, but they transferred it to the necessity of working on minorities, Indians, Chicanos, and Mexicans, and the mind control program escalated tremendously after this operation. And John Connally from Texas was a member of the PERMINDEX organization, along with Roy Cohn, described in the Torbett document and many other places of his role behind the assassination of the President of the United States, whereby a coup literally took place in this country. And Connally was very active with the psychologists in turning the Whitman event into something that became a future tool of repression in the minds of the doctors and psychologists around the country. One brief item about Ronald Reagan, and many of you saw it on the news, an article in the New York Times, July 22nd, promoting Reagan for a third term, and they said President Reagan has often advocated a change in the Constitution to allow the president to serve more than 2 terms. I told you when Warren Burger resigned as Chief Justice to take over the Constitution celebration, the anniversary of the Constitution, the 2 most dangerous things would be to change the Constitution to allow Ronald Reagan to run a 3rd or a 4th term, and the other is to change it and have that foreign-born President of the United States, which would be Henry Kissinger. Now, many of you saw or didn't see the article this past week, Bechtel man chosen for new Pentagon post. And this is really interesting that Caspar Weinberger's from Bechtel Corporation and George Schultz is from Bechtel Corporation, and there's 4 or 5 other people high up in Washington in that corporation, closely linked. One of the directors was former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, John McCone, who was CIA director when Salvador Allende was murdered and they had the coup in Chile. And Bechtel is every bit a CIA Defense Department front as well. as a company that builds dams and factories, cement places, and construction all over the world. Now, the San Francisco Chronicle had a story ignoring congressional objections. Ronald Reagan has nominated Richard P. Godwin for a post in the Defense Department. It was a newly created post as Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition. David Packard, the same David Packard from the Bohemian Grove, who was on the 40 committee with Henry Kissinger, this prestigious national security decision-making group of 5 people of who lives and who dies. David Packard just did a study with the Defense Department and has strongly recommended that this man be in charge of all Pentagon purchases. I cite it because I don't think you have to look too far to see the massive tightening up of control in this country. The president having his finger over 40 or 50 of the federal judges, with Warren Burger working on the constitutional celebration, which will have some changes in it for sure, with Mr. Rehnquist, Judge Rehnquist, chairman of the bench, where he's not against martial law, and Mr. Packard of the Defense Department, and Hewlett Packard, that's the combined company, David Packard, recommending that all weapons be purchased through an agent of Bechtel Corporation. That means a control of where they go, who gets the contracts, how many there are, and it's a lot of information and power in the hands of this corporation, having the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense running the entire network of how we relate to other countries or deciding when we go to war. Speaking of Judge Rehnquist, Justice Rehnquist, there was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle this week, Why Justice Rehnquist Merits Confirmation, and it's written by Stanley Mosk, who's always passed himself off as somewhat of a liberal in California. He's on the Supreme Court in California. The interesting thing about Stanley Mosk is that years ago, when people were afraid of the John Birch Society and they were saying that General Eisenhower was a communist and they wanted to infiltrate all the boards of education, the schools, the textbooks, and the John Birch Society became very, very powerful, and its members were able to get Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan in as president. In the early days when the Birch Society was working and operating in the early 60s, it was Stanley Mosk who said there's nothing to fear by the John Birch Society. They are a bunch of little old women in tennis shoes. That's where the quotation came from. Many of you are too young to remember it. Some of you do. Well, the Birch Society turned out to be very powerful, and now, unless he puts on his dress and is dressing as a man and is an old lady in tennis shoes, Mr. Rehnquist is a hardcore member of the John Birch Society, and he will be our new Chief Justice. The other point to remember is that Stanley Mosk also worked for the Warren Commission. His name is on the Warren Report, is one of the attorneys for the Warren Report, which was put together by Alan Dulles of the Central Intelligence Agency and John J. McCloy of the intelligence community, and he was an attorney hired by them to put together that document that was totally a farce. There have been hundreds of books written criticizing it and the errors and the inconsistencies. So why would somebody believe Stanley Mosk when they say that Mr. Rehnquist merits confirmation? Helmut Kohl requested today that there be freedom for Mr. Hess, Rudolf Hess, the oldest person residing in the Spandau prison, and he asked for it on humanitarian grounds. It's interesting that Helmut Kohl is requesting this, being as he pressured the President of the United States to go to Bitburg. If he didn't want the President to honor the graves of the Waffen SS, I wouldn't care what he says about Hess, and actually Hess isn't important, whether he's alive or dead or whether he's in or out Spandau, except that he has been a hero to people such as Larry McDonald, who, when he was alive, was pushing for Hess to get out, and also, besides Larry McDonald, a president of the John Birch Society, along with activities of Justice Rehnquist, pushing for this were the members of the Aryan Nation, those people that want to make the Northwest an all-white territorial balkanization plan of the United States. The Aryan nations have been very close to Mr. Hess in talking about him and promoting him as a hero, as did Larry McDonald. So with Helmut Kohl, there are a lot of different diverse groups that have more in common than they seem to do, and I don't think it's him, but it's the symbolism of getting him out. Well, the fights to stop the first altered bacteria, genetically altered bacteria, are over. As of this Wednesday, they may begin in California to put these organisms out in potato plants in California. The court turned down the case that Jeremy Rifkin had filed, and so that is fait accompli. Now, what happens when the potato plants are sprayed? You won't know for 20 years when the bacteria is unleashed. People didn't know when the intelligence community was releasing bacteria in San Francisco in the harbor, and they didn't know when they had it on the subways in New York, and we don't know where they put their disease-causing bacteria, but we know there's more disease than ever, there's more cancer than ever, there's more sickness, and there's no way to pinpoint what they called tests with the passing out of bacteria that could cause, or viruses rather, that could cause disease. So the genetic engineering question is over because there's no way to prove for years how it leaps and jumps and how it infects the environment. There's an interesting story. Oh, I don't have time for this one. I was going to, well, real fast, the Washington Post has a story, New Front in War on Terrorism, Cultivating Foreign Opinion, June the 19th. We made such a botch of bombing Libya and making mistakes that the administration is finally saying that we will cultivate asking our allies what we were doing because there was so much anger at what we did at Libya, and also the feeble excuse of the Berlin disco bombing. Later it turned out not to be Gaddafi, but Syria, and so they now have said, we will consult our allies before we do something like that. My time is up. I didn't think I had time for that one story. I'll continue with some of these next week. This is Mae Brussell. Take care, and I'll be with you next week.